In this video discussion, I'm going to cover two readings, 15 and 16. They're both relatively short. I mean, the ideas are very important, but the readings themselves are very short. So I thought I would handle both 15 and 16 in this one lecture. Okay, let's start with patronymy and patriarchy. First of all, patronymy. You see the PATR, which signifies male, as in patriarchy, and then NYM. That has to do with naming. So patronymy is the practice that we're familiar with, where a woman will take her husband's surname upon marriage. As you read, even though it has a long history, and most women do that, there is no legal mandate to do so, but the social pressures can be enormous. Not quite as much today as they were even, let's say, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. But nevertheless, most women still do continue to take their husband's surname once they marry. Now, what are some of the reasons given for that? Well, you'll note I have some quoted points down here from Embleton and King from people they actually surveyed about this issue. And so these are actual comments people made in regard to why the wife should accept her husband's surname. So let's look at them and sort of address each one. The first one, but what will you call the children? It will be odd if your name was different from theirs. Well, that can simply be settled quite easily if the husband took the wife's surname. Right? So you see the obvious inherent double standard there. Secondly, but marriage will turn you into a new person. And you should show this by having a new name. Well, precisely the same exact thing happens to the male that's being married. So once again, it's only a patriarchal bias that says it's a woman that must accommodate the man. Next one, people will think that your husband is weak. Well, of course, that totally overlooks the fact that women have been treated as, at best, second-class citizens, have been mistreated, as the long history of misogyny shows, and that's not even being addressed there. The only concern is the treatment of the husband. And then finally, a common surname bounds a family together. Well, fine, let's use the woman's surname. Once again, an obvious double standard there is at play. So not only do we see this obvious patriarchal double standard at play in regard to the naming of individuals at marriage, there's also the issue of Mr. versus Miss and Mrs. Most people haven't really thought about this. In fact, until the so-called sexual revolution and women's liberation of the 1970s, when women began to use Ms., just MS period, no one had thought much about the issue. And why? Well, it's because discrimination against women was simply thought to be natural. And what do I mean by discrimination? Well, it should be pretty obvious. There's a little flow chart there that shows you why it obviously discriminates against women. Simply put, men have never been forced to reveal their marital status. Women have always been forced to reveal their marital status. And anyone who actually chose Ms., which is exact linguistic equivalent to Mr., was in for a ton of abuse by people protecting the hegemony. Hegemony means power and authority of patriarchy. Second to last paragraph, that the female is simply expected to compromise her individualism can be seen in the traditional practice where a man was addressed simply as Mr., but a woman was addressed as Miss or Mrs. depending on her marital status. Thus, a woman was always required to publicly display her marital status, whereas a man was not. Last sentence, another factor that might be considered is the fact that many people are getting married at an older age and are choosing not to have children. And so this practice, patronymy, will also attenuate. This practice of people getting married at an older age, not having children, will attenuate the patriarchal practice of patronymy. In other words, maybe last names won't mean as much. I'm sure you know of cases where women who have, quote-unquote, made a name for themselves in a certain field simply continue to live with their last name upon marriage. Some are opting for the hyphenated version. Anyway, so that's an issue, one maybe you've never thought about. And then another issue regarding patriarchy is discussed in reading 16, and that's mythology and the pre-patriarchal goddess. Well, I did mention to you in passing that in pre-Neolithic times, in other words, before 10,000 years ago, and we're talking more precisely about the time period around 30,000 years ago, there was a quote-unquote age of the goddess, where many sort of statues and figurines of female divine figures were found. Well, let's look at this essay here. I begin by discussing the Enuma Elish, which is a Babylonian creation story where Marduk, a powerful male god, slays Tiamat, a female god. Please note that is a very common theme in Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Egyptian mythology, Sumerian mythology, as you see Babylonian mythology and Hebrew mythology, namely powerful male gods slaying female goddesses. In other words, men are powerful and righteous, and they're needed to vanquish the demonic, disruptive, chaotic female force. Now remember, once again, all of these myths were penned by males. And I think you begin to see a pattern here. Clearly, women were not writing these stories. This has some relevance for Judeo-Christian mythology because, as you note here, in the first Genesis creation story, by the way, there are two creation stories. This is the first one that begins in chapter 1. Elohim tames the primordial waters of the deep. And the word for the deep is Tehom. That's a sort of an anglicized version, T-E-H-O-M, and is thought by linguists to be a derivation of the earlier term Tiamat. So once again, you see this idea of a powerful male god slaying a female goddess. Continue reading. If these early textual representations of ancient mythology are viewed as authoritative, one might argue that there is something inherently superior in the notion of the male god as opposed to the female goddess. And of course, I don't have to tell you that because of this patriarchal bias, people commonly see God as a male, as God is often addressed as he or him or whatever. Let's see. What paragraph is it? Second paragraph. Feminist scholars point out the tendency to view the male god as the establisher and creator of order by subduing a goddess of chaos that has led to an association of the female with the natural world of death, sexuality, and other aspects of human existence. So in other words, historically and culturally, women have been associated with nature, which stands over and against culture as something that is bad. Thus the notion of, continue reading, thus the notion of female divinity has become almost anathema in the Western world. Last paragraph, I sort of review the history of patriarchy once again. I'm going to read the last 8 lines or so. We might surmise that the enthusiasm shown in the early Babylonian, Greek, I could also add Egyptian, Sumerian, Hebrew, and Hebrew religious traditions for male gods rather than female gods could quite possibly have been an attempt to usurp, so to speak, the primacy of the goddess in the ancient Western world. This could have been a byproduct of the almost natural cultural evolution from the small band-level hunting and gathering societies that emphasized fertility and the regeneration of life, with the obvious female connection to these phenomena. This is during a time when women were honored, to the larger, densely settled pastoral, horticultural, and later agricultural societies where a complex division of labor, rank, privilege, and thus patriarchy all became part of human life. The relegation of the female to subordinate status quite possibly resulted in a concomitant diminution of the goddess to a subordinate status as well. So just another peek into the cultural history of patriarchy.